Palestine, or the Palestinians, they are celebrating now being the 194th member state of the United Nations. You remember that also we know that they have achieved only the observer status by the vote, but this is some step. And my question to Professor Pape, do you think it's a real progress for the Palestinian cause? And what are the possible consequences of this?
Right. I think on a symbolic level, this is indeed... No, it's not working?
It's not working. I just checked it again.
On a symbolic...
no, wait. Just wait.
Okay.
Just wait. Oh, I don't know.
Maybe it died.
No.
Oh, I'll hold it. I'll hold it. It's easy. Okay. On a symbolic level, I think this is an important step. I think more than anything else, it represents a willingness of the governments of the world, and especially of the Western world, to respect the shift in world public opinion on behalf of the Palestinians. So I think, in a way, the United Nations has ended a period in which a very small minority opinion on Israel and Palestine, namely Israel and the American point of view, has been broadcast as an international or global position. So on this level, I think it's important because it sort of it reflects democratically what a lot of people around the world feel. If you look at the United Nations Charter, the United Nations Charter begins, we the people of the world, not we the governments of the world. And so often, in the case of Israel and Palestine, the United Nations acted as if we, the governments of the world, decide what is the international public opinion. So I think in that respect, we should feel elevated, inspired, enthused by this kind of development. Practically, however, I think it doesn't mean anything. I think on the ground, what matters is the continued creeping, unilateral Israeli final attempt to create the map of Greater Israel as the political and military establishment of Israel understands it, and for which the vast majority of the Jewish electorate gives its blessing. And that idea is to control, either directly or indirectly, the space between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean in a way that would enable Israel to function as a state with a Jewish majority, even if demographically it's not, and to function as a powerful state that cannot be undermined from within by any counter demand. And the United Nations resolution is not powerful enough, doesn't have even the potential to be powerful enough to stop this from taking place. The clock of perpetuating an Israeli control in a way that would make it very difficult to undermine it is far quicker than the clock of a United Nations symbolic recognition that would be translated to appeals to the International Court of Justice and all the other hopes that people have as a result of this vote in the United Nations.
Thank you. My next question deals with a new book. It was recently published, entitled Palestine in Israeli School Books, Ideology and Propaganda in Education. The author is Nurit Peled El-Hanan, the daughter of a former general, Matti Peled, who was well known during the war in 1967. For the audience, I add that Nurit is lecturer in language education in the Faculty of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And we must also know that her father, Matti Peled, later on became a consistent peace activist. Now, can you illustrate by one or two personal examples, experiences, the kind of indoctrination in your school days in Haifa?
Oh yes, and I think that also Nurit in her book gives very illuminative examples. And I think that the main examples have to do with the fact that the Palestinians do not exist within the historical narrative of Palestine. I remember in my school days, and that was repeated by some of my university professors, but not all of them. I remember the main thing that, in a way, in me triggered a kind of a counter-thought. There were two mythologies that did not work well together, and they're still there in Israeli textbooks today. Very interesting. One mythology is that Palestine was an empty land when the Zionist settlers arrived. But the other mythology was that the Palestinians left on their own accord. And I remember asking my history teacher, and he already noticed that troubles would await me in my longer career. I asked him, if the country was empty, who were the people who left? And they've never resolved this contradiction. Later on, there was an interesting, you probably remember Peter's book, John Peter's book. There was an interesting American attempt to help the Zionist narrative by saying that in the 1930s, actually the Palestinians were people who came in the 1930s from Egypt and Syria, which even Israeli scholars found a bit too much, as if you remember Yoshua Porat's very critical attack on John Peters. And I think this is still there. Now, more powerful, I think, are the maps that we had in school and the maps that also Nurit describes in her book. The map have no Palestinian names in them. It's like Arabic, Islam, Palestinians were already taken out of the cartographic representation of the place. This is my great worry, because if you, as a young person, are educated that someone who's actually there isn't there, and you grow up to see that they are there are two options. Either you say, what I learned in school was stupid, they should have known that these people are there, and you rebel against the indoctrination, which is what happened to me. Or you say they shouldn't be there. And this can have horrific consequences for the future generation.
After the war, his father cleared his throat. It's Miko who writes it like that. He cleared his throat. He spoke of the unique chance the victory offered Israel to solve the Palestinian problem once and for all. And I quote, "For the first time in Israel's history, we are face to face with the Palestinians without other Arab countries dividing us. Now we have a chance to offer the Palestinians a state of their own. If we kept these lands, popular resistance to the occupation was sure to arise, and Israel's army would be used to quell that resistance. with disastrous and demoralizing results. And Matti Pellet concluded before his general colleagues that this would turn the Jewish state into an increasingly brutal occupying power and eventually into a binational state. We are interested to know how you comment this, looking back as a historian and looking ahead.
There are two responses. Of course, one is that the Palestinians inside Israel were submitted for 19 years to a cruel military rule, far more cruel than the one that was about to be transferred from them to the occupied territories. And secondly, that Israel was already a binational state in 1967. Now, of course, if you play the game of numbers, you would say it's easier to be a binational state when the Palestinians are just 20%, which is Israel before 67. And he's right from his perspective that Israel with 50% of Palestinians would find it more difficult to be a binational state. But if you are even tiny little bit not a Zionist, which Matti Pellet was, you are not playing with numbers. You are opposed to the principle that you count people according to their ethnicity or nationality. And I think this is the tragedy of the Zionist left, that Matti Pellet was one of its most important, eloquent, and honest people. But it shows you why in many ways the Zionist left did more damage than the right wing in Israel in this respect, with this idea that here 67 is a chance to solve the problem, whereas there isn't. On the other hand, undoubtedly, the way that the Israelis decided to act in 1967 and not even to allow the Palestinians in the occupied territories to develop their own statehood only augmented, only aggravated the situation. So I think, however, that today in 2012, there is one, and I hoped, I tried to clarify it tonight. That's what I came to talk about. We should not look at 1967 as such a dramatic event. 1967, for the Israeli state, for the Zionist movement, was a completion of 1948. It was not a new chapter. And the peace process so far has failed because it accepted this Israeli claim of the left. Even you in Switzerland, the Geneva Initiative is based on this idea, that things can be returned back to June 67, but not to May 1948. If you come back to June 67, you can solve the conflict. Namely, you can do it with forgetting what happened in 80% of Palestine. You can do it with disregarding half of the Palestinians, with regarding what happens to the Palestinians inside Israel, and so on. And it failed because even the Palestinians, and we know there are Palestinians, who were colleagues of Matti Pellet in all kinds of associations, even the Palestinian leaders who went along with that did not really believe that this was the way forward. And they wanted some assurances that somehow the Israelis would show that there is a future for human rights and civil rights long in distance after the two-state solution. But what they realized, of course, was that the two-state solution, even in Matti Pellet's very enlightened words, is a tactic to solve the demographic problem of a racist ideology.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're right, I haven't mentioned extensively the United States, although I did mention that the resolution in the United Nations was a counter public opinion to the American position, but you're right. I think the reason is that I came tonight to talk about 1948 and its importance. And it's fair to say that the United States' role in 1948 was not that crucial. It was important, but it was not that crucial. In fact, until the assassination of President Kennedy, the various American administrations' position on Israel and Palestine, if you read them, were far more progressive than any of the positions of the European governments today, which is quite an amazing revelation to many of my Arab and Palestinian friends. They supported in principle the right of return. They looked for ways of allowing the refugees to return. It's very interesting, and one of the reasons that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to establish AIPAC in the 1950s was a feeling that America is going in a direction that is very harmful to Israel. Now, I won't go as far as the American director Lawrence Stone in his film JFK, who hints that the Israelis had a deep interest in seeing JFK being murdered because of that. I don't think it's true, but it's undeniable that Lyndon Johnson's started a new chapter in the history of Anglo-American-Israeli relationship. And therefore, I think when we analyze historically 48, America is not very important. It is, of course, you're absolutely right, afterwards. And I think it's much more important in the way that it allowed Israel from June 1967 to establish facts on the ground in the West Bank, knowing that these were severe violations of the international law. You know, the documents of 67 are open now. And Tom Segev has written about it also in his book, 1967. The Americans were surprised how the Israelis acted as occupiers in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And when they asked the Israelis about it, the Israelis told them, what we expect you is not to criticize us. And the Americans accepted this Israeli position, which JF Kennedy would have never accepted, which President Eisenhower would have never accepted, but which President Johnson did accept, and all the rest of them did. And I think this is an interesting, beyond this, all these theories of how important Israel is, which are correct, and my friend Noam Chomsky writes about it, how important Israel is in the way American imperialism was developed in the Middle East and so on. We have, as historians, to teach our students not to be, I don't know if there's a translation for this, teleological, determinist. We should not be determinist. American policy was not always what it is now. And that's a thought for hope. There's a hope that something can also change that. Thank you. You know, it reminds me when my publisher said to me, is it wise to use the term ethnic cleansing in your book? Because it might remind people of other periods in history. And I said, what's the point of being an intellectual? What's the point of being an historian? What's the point of being a human being if you are not allowed to call the reality for what it is? And I think that especially if you understand how the Holocaust memory is manipulated in Israel to Nazify the Palestinians, you would understand how important it is actually to say to the Israeli Jews, don't tell us that you are the victims of the most horrific crime in history. You may be the victims, or you may represent the victims of the most horrific crime in history. But as such, you should not get closer to do the same crimes to others. And if you are not able to discuss this openly, if you're not able to discuss it openly, you are going to be in a situation which was so cleverly articulated by one of our greatest journalists in Israel, unfortunately who died many years ago, a dear man called Aryeh Kaspi, not known in the West at all. He was the deputy editor of Haaretz, an amazing man. And he said, I live in a society which, as long as you do to the Palestinians almost what had been done to the Jews, not exactly, almost, it's okay. And he said, that worries me. What is the almost? How does the almost shift? When it becomes so close that we cannot use the word almost anymore. And I think that this is horrific. Let me tell you something. I know my answers are long, but what can you do? That's me. I started my talk tonight about the evidence. And we will put the evidence on a website with subtitles in German and in English and so on, despite the uneasiness of those who gave the testimony about it. As I told you, we're going to ignore their wish not to be exposed. We think it's too important. And one of them says, you know, one of the things we wanted always to do to the Palestinian refugees after we expelled them was to find out where the women were hiding their jewelry. Because we knew that Palestinian women, especially as dowry, you know what a dowry is? Yeah, it's a German word for this. The dowry, they get all kinds of coins, which is, I don't know if you know, but the Palestinian folklore, this beautiful jewelry that is made of Ottoman coins and British coins and so on. And they were looking for it. And women who were running away from the villages were hiding them. And they said, we wanted to find the place where they hid it. So we took Jews who just came from Europe, because they were refugees, and they knew exactly where their women were hiding their jewelries. I'm not the one who makes these connections. They were the ones who were making these connections in more than one testimony. In more than one testimony. You know, we had a famous national singer, Yafa Yarkoni, who everybody admired, and 2 years before she died, nobody spoke to her anymore. And you know why? Because she found out that soldiers in the checkpoints used to tattoo numbers on Palestinians. And she said the obvious. I don't have to even repeat the obvious, right? I don't have to. You understand what tattooing numbers on arms means. What was the Israeli reaction? To boycott her, not to punish the soldiers. So we are moving slowly into that pit. And if we are not going to use the right words, the movement would never be stopped towards the abyss of Jews and Arabs alike. Oh, no, I don't think so. Ben-Gurion, first of all, you have to understand, let me start by saying, most Israeli historians who deal with the history of Israel, and that's the vast majority of professional historians in Israel. That makes sense, by the way. Maybe it's the same in Switzerland, I don't know. But in Israel, most of those who are professional historians, right, those whose job is to write history, and they get paid by the state, write about the history of Israel, Zionism, Judaism, and so on. Very few of them are interested in what are the relationship between the state or the movement to the Palestinians. I'm one of the few Israeli historians who is interested in this. The vast majority of them are interested in how the Zionist movement built the state, how the Hebrew language was reawakened, how the people fought bravely against the British attempt to stop immigration from Europe, how the health system was built, how the Hebrew literature developed. And in all these important aspects of life, David Ben-Gurion played an amazing role. He was really a unique person. There isn't one aspect of life in the new Jewish existence in Palestine which he did not take part in. So opening the diaries is very important for Zionist historians in Israel. You have to understand, when people like me come to the diaries and we are concerned about how the other is treated, how the native Palestinian is treated, we have to work quite hard. He doesn't mention the Palestinian Arabs in every entry in his diary. He actually quite scarcely mentions them. Yes, he mentions them quite a lot when he writes in the 1948 period. Of course, they were part of the daily occupation of the future prime minister of Israel. But for most Israelis, I don't know if you've been there, Sde Boker, the kibbutz where he died and lived the rest of his life, is like a shrine. It's a shrine, and his archive is a shrine, not because it holds quotes that should make every Israeli shiver. No, it's a shrine because the man was a genius. He did Bible classes in his house. He foresaw the future. And in many aspects, this analysis is correct. The man was a genius. He was unique. People like me spoil the party a little bit when we come and say, yes, it's true, but he was also an ethnic cleanser. And then, you know, they have to decide whether to accept it or to kill the messengers because they don't like the message. To my regret, they still prefer the second option. But I think that's why they opened it up. And final point on this. You know, when the 1948 documents were opened for the first time in 1978, because we have the 30 years secrecy rule in Israel, 15 to 20 Israeli historians went to the archives. Only 3 of them came out and said, what we saw in the archives totally contradicts what we learned in school. 12 of them said, the archives substantiate what we already knew. Which is an interesting philosophical question, how do you know what is true and not true in history? But this is for another lecture and another debate with positivist historians, which I'm sure are abundant all over the place. Okay. Yes, it's a very important question. I hope I understood it because even my German took it a bit different. I think you were asking about how do we deal with this transformation from a victim to victimizer with the Holocaust in the background as the major kind of syndrome, as you call it. And I think that's very important. It's a very important question. I'm not only an historian, I'm also a peace activist for most of my life. And the area I believe I can contribute, and I'm trying to contribute in Israel itself, is in education. And I think part of the greatest challenge that we have as educators in Israel is to engage with manipulated fear. Not only with a victimizer that believes that he's a victim, or a victimizer that used to be a victim, but with a genuine fear. As you know, part of racism in the world is due to fear. Now, in the case of the Israelis, as I said to someone in the break, to come to a younger generation of Israeli Jews, when in the background you have Qassam rockets, you have suicide bombs, you have rhetoric of Iranian leaders, or political Islamic leaders, when the background is the kind of mechanism that I described in my lecture, where the reaction to your action justifies your next action, to come and say to people, you shouldn't be fearful. Okay, they say that they want to kill you, they say that they throw bombs at you, but, you know, basically these are good people you should share the land with, is not an easy message. I mean, you can do it when both sides are come from two Swiss villages, but even there I'm not sure it's a good idea. But definitely not with this kind of history. And I think engaging Edward Said, the late Edward Said, had a good point about it. He wrote a lot about victims and victimizer and the fact that the Palestinians should, A, not deny the Holocaust, but also realize where they are in the chain that begins in the Holocaust, that they are the victims of the victims. And he wrote something very important about it. He said, you should never give up explaining to people what is the source of the violence, the very essential source of the violence. And don't make, he said, any concessions to your own side on this. And he said, the basic thing is to try and to explain to people in Israel and those who support Israel what is clear to everyone in the world, but understandably not so clear to Israelis. And that is the following, that if you come and you colonize someone else's land, it's an act of violence. It's a very brutal act of violence. In fact, it's the worst act of violence because it denies every basic right that a human being has to the place where he lives. There's a famous correspondence, which I use in my educational projects, between Martin Buber and Mahatma Gandhi, which I think everybody should study. Gandhi annoyed Buber by not willing to endorse even a soft version of Zionism. This is why we don't have any street named after Gandhi in Israel. We have two streets named after Gandhi, but that's an Israeli general who was a racist, who was called Gandhi because of his skin complexion. But he was not really a Gandhi. Gandhi is not mentioned in any streets in Israel. And why? Because he wrote to Buber, if you came to Palestine as poor Jews who were expelled or under danger, whom Europeans didn't want, and you came to the Palestinians and said, we would like to live here with you, not instead of you. We would like to have a shelter here, because unlike Europeans, Muslim societies usually provided the shelter. It wouldn't be the first time. When the Spanish Inquisition happened in the half of the 15th, was late, I'm not a medievalist, I think the late 15th century, the Ottoman Empire offered them refuge. If they would ask for refuge, the Palestinians were one of the most ideal society for such a request. But to come, to use the hospitality, to learn from the Palestinians how to cultivate the land, because Jews, for anti-Semitic reasons, didn't know how to cultivate land, and then to use it to expel the Palestinians? I am outraged as an historian when I write it. You are amazed that the Palestinians are outraged by that? You're amazed that this is why violence begins in Palestine? Of course it's soluble. You can solve it. There's a way of decreasing the violence. There's a mechanism for reconciliation. But like in South Africa, you cannot start reconciliation and say if it's successful, we'll give up apartheid. Doesn't work. You give up apartheid and then there is reconciliation. You give up Zionism and then there is reconciliation, not the other way around. No state solution. I think the two-state solution is dead for all intents and purposes. Whether it was a good idea, whether it is a bad idea, it doesn't matter anymore. I don't think that there is any space, infrastructure, circumstances, or conditions in which you can create something that even resembles a viable state. So it doesn't really matter anymore. And there is already a one state. Israel is the regime, the powerful regime that controls the life of all the Palestinians, as we saw, including those in the Gaza Strip. Yes, Palestinians react to this regime. And in the Gaza Strip, they challenged the Israelis and said, come and invade us if you dare, as you did. But that didn't change the reality that Israel is in control, not the Palestinians. So in fact, I think that although it's very important to talk about one state and two states, I would begin one step earlier. And that is an international community that maybe is changing now, that said there's only one side that matters when the future is concerned, and that's the state of Israel. What it wants matters. What it is worried about matters. What it is concerned about matters. All the rest are not important. And I think the importance of the one state, even before it becomes a practical solution, and that's an unenviable task, to prepare a political system when the vast majority of the Jews in Israel are against it. I understand it. I live there. I come from there. But before you do that, I think that realizing that the Palestinians have an equal, at least an equal, share in their future is a very good beginning, because then you start to talk about issues that would lead the way to one state solution. You see, if you say the Palestinian refugees are equal partners to the Russian Jews who arrived yesterday from St. Petersburg, and I see most of these Russian Jews pray every Sunday in the Orthodox Church next to my house. So if you say the refugees and these Russian Orthodox Jews or Christians, doesn't matter, have the same right about the future, you're already talking about one state. You're already talking about state. If you say the Palestinian minority inside Israel is part of the dialogue of the future, you're already talking about one state. So I think that in a very short time we will see these processes begin, but people would be very careful not to talk about it as a one-state solution. But they will do practically things that would say, okay, there's one state, there is a regime that we're not totally happy with, that doesn't respect human rights, does not respect civil rights, but maybe there's a peaceful way of making it a better regime, more democratic, more universal, not racist, not ethnic. There's no reason in the world that every decent person would support such a development.